Have you noticed recently that they keep coming out with new editions of Monopoly, where the streets aren't the familiar Marvin Gardens and Boardwalk, Atlantic City, of course. There's a Los Angeles version now with Sunset Boulevard and some of those streets, and even a Hollywood version, which I imagine has Rodeo Drive and all of Beverly Hills Boulevards featured in the high rent district. It was amusing recently to read how comedian Stephen Wright had made the comment, "I don't think it's right that only one company gets to make the game Monopoly." In any case, there's a common motif for many of these board games. Every player starts out with a certain amount of money, and the object is to make a whole lot more. As we all know, the goal in Monopoly is not only to have all of the money for yourself, to wipe out everybody else so that they don't have any. When everyone declares Chapter 11 except you, then you win. Now, here in Matthew chapter 25, a kind of Monopoly game is being started, but with one huge difference. There are 3 players, and the master of the house sets them each up with an initial fund and instructs them to see what they could do with the money. Let's pick up the story right here in verse 14. "For the kingdom of heaven will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey." It's been a common theme in these parables thus far that the math of God's kingdom is poles apart from what we ever learned in grade school or what you find printed inside the box of a Parker Brothers game. Because in this experiment, the master of the estate gives each one of the men different amounts. When they pass go, they don't all collect $200. In fact, one man, apparently the smartest of the 3, starts the game with 5 times as much as the low man on the totem pole. Now, the Bible tells us why the master does this. Notice, he gave them talents, each according to his ability. The man with the greatest potential got the most, and the servant with very little investment skills got a rather small portfolio. And how do we as humans feel about this kind of skewed, biased math? As we recorded this devotional series, there in New York and Los Angeles, the baseball season was getting underway, and a couple of superstar players, admittedly the best players on their respective teams, and maybe for the whole franchise in a couple of years, had been holding out for new contracts. They wanted something like a couple $100 million over the next few years. $100 million. Many, many other players, all of them in fact, were getting quite a bit less than that. A few of them have to scrape by almost on welfare, earning maybe only a couple $100,000 a year. And of course, those of us sitting in the stands, way up high in those nosebleed seats, just can't relate to all these kinds of home run numbers. But these 2 guys wanted to be paid according to their abilities. But in the Bible, this master or team owner who represents God actually does hand out different sums to different people based on his assessment of abilities. If we segue from thinking of talents as money to thinking of talents as abilities, or talents, of course, that's the point of this whole story. And anytime you go to a church and sit down in a pew, you're immediately confronted with this. Some Christians, just plain and simple, have more ability than other ones. Some preachers are better than others. Some believers barely have one gift, if that. While others seem to do absolutely everything in the church, do it well, drive up to the church parking lot in a Rolls Royce to boot. And they're the people, obviously, who started out the game with $5,000. The thing we all have to keep in mind every day of our lives, of course, is this. Whose money is this? It belongs to the master, doesn't it? It wasn't the servant's money. It was the boss's. He entrusted it to them, but it was still his. And so it was entirely appropriate for him to look real hard at the resumes of his servants and then place them in charge of different money market accounts according to his own wisdom about what they could handle. Now, how is it when it comes to the Christian man or woman and the issue of talents? Whose talents are they? Well, maybe you think that your abilities are your abilities, but think again. Where'd they come from? Who gave them to you? Who entrusted you with the talents you have today, right now? In the Tyndale New Testament commentary for Matthew, written by Dr. R.T. France, the author makes this comment, and I'm going to quote, "In the context of Jesus' ministry, the sums of money entrusted to the slaves are more likely to represent not natural endowments given to men in general, but the specific privileges and opportunities of the kingdom of heaven. You might be good with your hands, or you might have a great singing voice, or be skilled at organizational matters. Those are your gifts, and to be sure, they came to you from God. But in the Christian faith, it's also true that when a person commits his or her life to God, they're also endowed with spiritual gifts that go beyond just talents and musical aptitude. Leadership turns into spiritual leadership. A hospitable personality is especially guided into the spiritual gift of giving a person spiritual comfort. And here for sure we can know that the gifts are God's ownership and that they've simply been entrusted to us for use in service to Him. In the telling of this little story, Jesus gives us a clue as to the importance of these talents. In Bible times, we read in various commentaries, a talent of silver was a huge amount of money. A talent was equivalent to 60 minas, and a mina was 100 drachmas. Well, that doesn't mean much until we learn that a drachma was basically a day's pay for a common person. That would make a talent, just one talent, the equivalent of 6,000 days' pay. That's about 20 years worth of salary for most of us, and this master gives out 5 talents, 2 talents, and 1 talent to these 3 men. So it's not just pocket change. This is a serious expression of trust and also a great spiritual challenge. What will you do with this money? But I want to reiterate again, this is God's money. Or in your case, these are the talents God entrusted to you or loaned to you. That line got a bad rap a few years ago when a certain Rush Limbaugh liked to boast on radio that he was talent on loan from God. But in the best of senses, and humblest too, that's a true statement. Our money and our fortunes and our abilities are really God's resources entrusted to us. This should give each of us 2 things for sure. One would be a quiet combination of humility and contentment. If you're a genius, it's because that's what God gave you. If you're a millionaire, that's God's blessings. True, you may have worked hard to use and fine-tune those gifts and turn them into a nice fortune. But who gave you the aptitude to be a hard worker, a success-minded person instead of a sleep-until-noon bum? That came from God too. So as we consider this human package called self, and then as we look around at the other packages in the house or in the church, some of them bigger and better, some of them not quite as good, can we be content and humble because that is how God gave things out? That's so hard to do, isn't it? And don't we all spend a lot of time each day either complaining to God that we're on the short end or patting ourselves on the back for being somewhere on the rich and pretty end of the spectrum? And point 2 is this. If the money is God's, then shouldn't we be bold in investing for Him? He told us to go for it. He challenged us to double His portfolio. He went on an important trip and left us in charge of some pretty exciting missions down here. Are we taking a chance, investing here, looking over there for the best and brightest opportunities? Sometimes people bet scared with their own little bankroll. But God has invited us to do great things with the talents He loaned us. He wants 2 to 4 to turn into 5, and 5 to turn into 10, and then 20 and 40, and so on. It's his money. It's his game. In fact, it's his Wall Street.